So today we want to finish up the accounting review. Remember last class we looked at the balance sheet, income statement, statement of owner's equity. I gave you a quick intro to the template, and then we got started on statement of cash flows. So I want to finish up the statement of cash flows today, get into this very important concept of free cash flow. We'll hit on it just barely in this class. I encourage you, especially finance majors, Dr. Katapakam in his corporate finance class, an excellent class. He goes a lot more deeply into free cash flow and how we use it in finance. It's an extremely important concept. And then we'll get back into the template today. Hopefully get through liquidity as far as we can, and then maybe start solvency. We'll see. So the statement of cash flow provides details on obviously the changes in cash. And there's three components there: cash from operations, cash from or for financing activities, and cash from and or for investing activities. So cash from operations, so it's essentially the income statement, but on a cash basis. Remember, we talked about accrual accounting, things like accounts receivable, inventories, accounts payable, items that are very closely tied to operations, but we don't use them entirely on a cash basis. We do accruals because of the matching concept in GAAP accounting. And the two largest differences between net income and cash from operations is the change in working capital. We're going to talk a whole lot about this here pretty soon. It's probably the most important concept and the most difficult concept under liquidity. And then depreciation. Depreciation is just a non-economic way the accountants that come up for expensing an asset over time. So you buy a building, you don't want to expense it because it's an asset, it has future value, so you set it up as an asset. But it is an asset that's going to wear down over time, so we just take that purchase. The purchase is in the investing activities. So if you buy a building, it's a cash outflow for investing activities. But over time, we're going to move the cost of that building to operations by depreciating the building. But there's no cash when we do that. All the cash was when we bought the building, down in cash from investing activities. And so that depreciation is a non-cash expense. So we add that back to net income to get the cash from operations. So those are the two adjustments. Working capital can be positive or negative, depending on whether accounts receivables are increasing or decreasing. Depreciation is always an add back to cash. So we're going to compare. I'm not going to do it exactly like it's in this note. You're going to see the way we're going to look at it. But one thing we'll notice, especially with these working capital accounts, that if management is trying to cook the books a little bit, they're trying to distort and manipulate earnings, they usually have to do it in a way that will distort working capital accounts. So if we really focus on, that's what this note is saying, if we really focus on the difference between net income, earnings for interest and taxes, depreciation, amortization, we'll get into that a little bit later. Compare that to this cash from operation, which is the biggest difference is going to be this working capital accounts. If we compare the two, we notice maybe earnings is going up, but cash from operations is flat or going down. Then we have to ask the question, is management doing something to manipulate earnings? And so we'll look at that. I'll give you a chart for your company when you do your analysis that will hopefully help you assess whether you should be worried about what we call quality of earnings. I moved quality of earnings from liquidity down to solvency, and you'll see that why that's the case here when we get into that part of the analysis. Cash for financing activities for or from is firms issuing stock, borrowing money, buying back stock, paying dividends. There's one flaw that the accountants have made, and that is where they put interest expense. Interest expense should be under financing activities. However, they leave interest expense under cash from operations. That's one of those things that we should be fixing, but we don't. We don't make that adjustment in this class. I'm just going to leave interest expense as part of CFO, but it should be moved. It's hard to move it. You would think it'd be easy to just move the interest expense, just add it back to cash from operations and subtract it from financing activities. However, interest expense is not on a cash basis. It has many accruals, some of them quite bizarre because of the way accounting works for capitalizing interest into certain projects. So it's not just a matter of, I do actually do that. I will actually take the interest expense on income statement and add it back to cash from operations and subtract it from financing activities. But it's not exactly accurate because it's not on a pure cash basis. But other than that, cash for financing is anything related to stockholders, anything related to bondholders with the exception of interest expense. And then a very, very important one is the investing activities. This is the purchase and sell of those long-term assets, buildings, buying other companies, buying certain investments, anything that would go on the balance sheet as an asset. When we buy those or sell those, that should be cash for investing activities. Now, there's one that's more important than any of the others, and we'll talk some about this when we do your financial analysis, and that's capital expenditures, or you might have heard the term CapEx. Capital expenditures. I don't like the word capital in there because it really confuses accounting versus finance. We might get into that discussion a little bit, but capital expenditures, those are expenditures that you make part of the normal operations of the business. So it's buying fixed assets. It's not buying long-term financial assets, but it's buying buildings, buying equipment, investing in anything that expands the building. So Walmart building new stores would be part of that. So CapEx is very, very important because that's where management makes decisions about expanding the business, changing the business. So when you do your team project, which is a cost-benefit analysis, it is very much a CapEx type of project. You're trying to make the decision, should we make this capital expenditure? Would it be a good decision? It's one of the most important decisions management makes, how they're going to reinvest in the firm. This one exception is not important for us, so you can just read through that. All right, so that's a review. I did that last class as well, but it's really important that you understand this. So sorry for some repetition, but I think it's really healthy that you have a really good understanding of the statement of cash flows, because a lot of students get really confused on what is where and where I picked up numbers, and the cash flow statement has a lot of really important information. So another good review, hopefully from your accounting class and from our third class, and now today, you're getting a good remembrance of the statement of cash flows. There's two types of statements of cash flows. There's the direct method and the indirect method. I've almost always just seen the indirect method. So the direct method, though there are some benefits to that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The indirect method is what you almost always see, and that's where they take net income and they add or subtract things back to get you the cash from operations. So what is better, cash from operations or GAAP net income? And the answer is they both have their strengths, they both have their weaknesses. The strength of cash from operations is that cash is cash. There's no management accruals, there's no accounts receivable, there's no accounts payable. So cash is cash. The problem with GAAP net income is you do have accruals, which involves a lot of management estimates and assumptions, and because of that, it can be manipulated. However, cash from operations can be manipulated as well, because at December 31st, if a firm wants to have something in this year or next year, they can just delay the payment 1 year or 1 day, delay a payment 1 day, and they move an expenditure from this year to the next year. So right at the end of the year, cash from operations can be easily manipulated by simply the delaying or moving up or moving back a payment by 1 day. So especially at those right at the end of the year, right at the end of the quarter, cash from operation is the most manipulable because management can slightly change the timing of a payment. But other than that, cash from operations is going to be very accurate because cash is cash. You either paid cash or received cash, and there's not much debate about that. So both are important, both have their strengths and weaknesses. What I'm going to argue is comparing the two can give you some information on whether or not something unusual is going on with the company. So that brings up this concept of free cash flow. You've got it here in the notes. I'm going to slip over the PowerPoint and summarize the blog that I showed you to read, told you to read. That blog goes a little bit more detailed than what's here in the class notes. So I want to flip over to that blog. So let's first define free cash flow. What does it mean for a cash flow to be free? So cash flow is not free because it doesn't cost anything. Cash has a cost of capital. We'll talk about that later in the class. The firms don't have anything that's free. Any cash they hold, any asset they hold, they've got to make a return on that. So it's not free in the standpoint it doesn't cost anything. What they mean by free, when you see free cash flow, is that management has the freedom, has the options to do something with that cash flow. They have a choice on how they are going to deploy that cash. So they have some cash that they produce in the business, and management is free to do whatever they want to, no strings attached. And what can they do? Well, they could pay a dividend to a stockholder. They could do what a lot of firms are doing these days, and you'll definitely see that with your company, for some of your companies, is repurchase their stock. So paying dividends or repurchasing your stock, that's very similar. That's money that's going to the stockholders. So if a firm has extra cash, they don't know what to do with it, then give it back to your stockholders. Or if they have some debt, they can pay down the debt. Now there are firms like Lululemon that do not have debt. We'll talk about that later. Does it make sense for a firm not to have any debt at all? So there are some firms like Lululemon that don't have debt, but there's other firms like Ford, Motor Company, Kroger's, they have an enormous amount of debt. So if a firm has a lot of debt, it may make more sense not to pay your stockholders, but instead pay down some of the debt. Another thing they can do is expand company capacity. This is what we call expansion CapEx. So that's Walmart building new stores. It would be Costco building stores in Canada or in Central America, expanding the business. It'd be Accenture moving overseas, maybe moving into Africa or into South America. It'd be that kind of expansion of the business, those kind of capital expenditures that expand the business. Or they can just hold in cash, and that's what Apple's doing. That's what Google's doing. It's amazing. Some of these big tech firms, they have hundreds of billions of dollars. Microsoft, just billions and billions of dollars in cash that is just sitting there, which they're not really sure what to do with it. Apple is a firm that's the worth of the firm is around $1 trillion, pretty amazing, but over 200 billion of that is just sitting in cash. A big part of their valuation is just sitting in cash. So those are the 5 things management does when they have free cash flow. They'll do one of these things. And so we know a firm must be producing free cash flow. That's extra cash over and above what they need just to keep the trains running, the normal operations. And that's what we want firms to do. We want firms to produce free cash flow. We want them doing these things. So if a firm is producing free cash flow, you should see these kind of things going on. Firms producing free cash flow will do especially these first 3 things. Now it is possible, and you'll see some of your firms, they'll pay dividends and repurchase stock, but they do it by borrowing money. So if they borrow money in order to do 1 and 2, that's not free cash flow. If they borrow $1 billion in order to repurchase $1 billion in stocks, that nets out to 0. That's not a free cash flow. But if they don't borrow any new money, but they do buy back $1 billion in stock, they must have free cash flow. They must have free cash flow in order to produce that extra cash to buy back their stock. Now, number 4 is the tricky one. Is the firm really expanding capacity, or is their capital expenditure just keeping the current capacity in shape? So if Walmart is refurbishing stores, painting stores, fixing stores, but they're not adding any new stores, then that is not expansionary CapEx. That's what we call maintenance CapEx. So bottom line, great companies can do these 5 things because they are producing, as part of their ongoing operations, they're producing free cash flows. Now, there are some entities that don't do that. Airlines are a good example of entities that do not produce, at least over the long term, historically, have not produced free cash flows. Why? Because there's so much they've got to do. They have to buy new planes to replace old planes. They're not adding new routes or they're not expanding their capacity. They're just spending a lot of money. They're very capital intensive businesses, and capital intensive just to keep doing what they've been doing. So those are not the businesses that finance likes. Finance likes businesses that produce free cash flow, so you can do these 5 things. So 3 of those 5 things are really easy to measure: paying dividends, buying back stock, paying down debt. The 5th one, you can look and see if they're buying a lot of cash and have other marketable securities. It can be a little tough. Apple was a little tough to see how much cash they're holding because they put it in several places on the balance sheet, but you can find it if you look for it. So the most difficult one is that 4th one. That is free cash flow that's expanding capacity. Now, a lot of people, when they calculate free cash flow, they subtract out all of that capital expenditure as if all of it is just maintaining the current operations. I think that's wrong. Firms have some capital expenditures that are maintenance, that just keep the firm going what it's currently doing. Some capital expenditures are expansionary. The parts that are expansionary, I consider that part of free cash flow. That's good cash because they're making the firm bigger, they're going to increase their growth. Those are good things. If you subtract all of capital expenditures, you're essentially saying all of CapEx, it's just maintenance CapEx. It's just to keep the business right where it is with no expansion. So when you talk about free cash flow, that's where I like to focus. If you remember my blog, that's really I focus in on. So how do you handle that CapEx? I don't think you subtract 100%. What you need to try to do is separate expansion CapEx from maintenance CapEx. Now, supposedly some firms have actually started reporting that, and so that's good. But then you're trusting management to make that distinction. If you saw my blog, I show you how I try to do it with Walmart. And with Walmart, what I did is I looked and said, okay, what's their most important expansionary CapEx? And to me, it's adding more square feet, adding more stores, more square feet. And so what I did is I ran a regression between their CapEx and their change in square feet. And what I try to do is say, okay, what would CapEx be if the change in square feet was 0? And that part of CapEx would be maintenance CapEx. And then the CapEx that increases as square feet increases, that's expansionary CapEx. So that works really well with Walmart. Pretty easy. I didn't get great numbers in the regression analysis, but they're good enough to give me some confidence of what percentage of CapEx is expansionary and what was maintenance. For other firms, that's really difficult to do because a lot of firms, like a Google or a Facebook, they don't build stores. They don't have square feet. For them, it's the number of employees is probably the most important thing. So it's a tough thing to look at. You'd have to really just sit down and try to get into detail exactly what their CapEx is. For some companies, like Walmart, it's easy. For other companies, it's a lot more difficult. But bottom line, this is what's so critically important. It's frustrating because it's difficult to measure. That's one reason why I love it, because if you're a finance major and you sit down and you do the work to figure this out, you'll have something that's quite valuable. So I actually like the fact that it's difficult and subjective and complicated, because that's where you can truly add value if you're a finance major or an accounting major or whatever. You know, that's where your value added is. It's those complicated businesses are complicated, the finances, the accounting are complicated. That's good. That's good news. That means you have the ability to add tremendous value. And so we're going to talk about economic value added later. But what we're saying is the best firms are those who generate free cash flows. And if they're doing that, they probably have what we call good economic value added. That is, their return on capital is greater than the return on capital that their investors require. So we're going to get into this. We have a few exercises you'll do in economic value added. So these firms should be deploying free cash flow to expand the firm, or if they don't have good expansionary opportunities, then they should send the free cash flow back to their owners. All right, so there's an overview of free cash flow. We're going to hit it at a very high level, not getting too much detail into it. I'm trying to encourage, especially the finance majors and the accounting majors, read up on this more. There's a book in my book reading list by William Priest, P-R-I-E-S-T, called Stockholder Value or Shareholder Value. I forget what it's called, but it's by William Priest. Excellent, excellent book. It's not a really long book. You could read it in less than a week very easily, probably in a day. But he really gets into this concept of how we assess firms based on free cash flow. So it's a book I highly recommend. So here's the book right here. Got a link to it, so I do recommend this book. It was funny. The year I retired from UTSA, I decided to do a big trip up to New York. There was a concert playing, a series of concerts. I wanted to go here. And while I was up there, it was somewhat my swan song. I went around and met with all our managers, and I did go to William Priest's company. We did not do any business with William Priest. I was paying for the whole trip out of my own funds, so it wasn't a business trip. So I could get away with doing a lot of personal things. So I went and visited his firm. It was one of the firms we've been talking to. But I went with the book, Shareholder Yield, hoping William Priest would be there and would sign the book. But he wasn't there, so I was kind of disappointed. But it's an interesting firm, very proud of what they do. So I do recommend this book. And then you've read my blog. So important concept. Make sure you understand it. Do a little bit of work, a little extra work understanding it, because it's really quite critical. All right, so now we're going to get into financial statement analysis. This is something I'm real picky on this. You're going to find I want to make sure what you do is truly meaningful. One of my biggest frustrations with financial statement analysis, and I've seen it so many times, I have students who sit down and do it and they're not saying anything. It's a lot of words. It sounds right because they're using a lot of kind of university, college student kind of jargon. But when you really look at it, it's like, what are you really saying? Are you really telling me anything? So I want to give you a template so you can be rigorous and know how to do this. If you're a finance major or an accounting major, there's a good chance you'll be doing something like this in the first few years of your first job. I teach a class. It's a class for seniors. It's called Security Analysis. And I used to just tell them, do a financial analysis if you're a company. And I've quickly learned I could not do that because what I received was so poorly done. And it just really bothered me that finance majors graduating with a degree in finance, when asked to do a financial analysis of a company, just had no clue where to start. Most of them would do the working capital ratio and the quick ratio. That was what almost every one of them, that was 50% of their analysis, which was interesting because those are two ratios we almost never use in finance. So the two ratios they showed were the two that we don't use in finance. So what we want to look at is see how a firm is doing using financial ratios. We want to compare them to other firms, compare them across time. So across time, we call that trend analysis. Comparing them to peers and to the industry, I'm going to give you in your company you're going to do, I'm going to give you the peer and industry information. You can compare firms of different sizes. So you can compare a Dollar General to a Walmart or a Costco, even though they're very different businesses, very different sized businesses. The actual business itself is very similar. And so you actually can compare them, even though one company might be 10 times larger than the other one. The other thing you can do is compare your company to rules of thumb. Now, rules of thumb are really tough because they're very industry specific. And I've seen some documents that provide those rules of thumb, and those documents can be hundreds of pages long. There's just so much there. So what we're going to do, and what I provided to you, and you'll see it here pretty quickly, is we're going to compare your firm to peers in the industry, and I'm going to set up those charts so that you'll get a good sense of what the rule of thumb is. For example, I'll compare your firm's debt to equity to see how much debt your firm has, and I'll compare it against the median for the industry, but also give you the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile, so you can see if your firm is close to the median or really high or really low. So we'll essentially create those rules of thumb by graphically letting you see your company versus what's going on with the industry. So that's not a bad way to do it. So we want to actually know the rules of thumb. I'll give you 1 or 2 rules of thumb as we go, but there aren't that many that are generic to all companies. Now when you use ratios, you got to be really, really careful. Negative numbers, dividing by numbers, dividing by 0, you got to be really, really careful. And so what I've done in the Excel file I've given you is I'm using the term NMF. That means not a meaningful figure. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with your firm. It just means that that particular ratio cannot be calculated. So the ratio I like to show is a CAGR. You can see here on page 8 of the notes, a CAGR, a compound annual growth rate. If you don't know how to calculate a CAGR, definitely learn how to do it because it's a number you'll use a lot. But it's essentially giving you a growth in something, but on an annual basis. We think in annual terms. So if I told you their revenue has grown 60% over the last 15 years, you're like, well, 60% sounds like a high number, but that's over 15 years. That's a hard number to try to, wrap your mind around. But if I tell you their revenues have grown 8% a year for the last 10 years, 8%, well, that sounds like a pretty good growth rate. That sounds good. So it gives you a little bit better understanding. The problem with the compound annual growth rate is if you look at the calculation, we're taking the last number we have versus the beginning year number we have. If one of these is negative and one positive, so maybe your ending number is, maybe you're looking at net income. So their ending net income is $500 million, but their beginning net income, because 10 years ago we were in a recession or come out of recession, maybe that was negative $40 million. Well, you cannot calculate a growth rate if the beginning and ending numbers have different signs. If the ending number is positive and the beginning is negative, you will get not a meaningful figure. So what do you do there? Well, we'll talk when we get to the examples. When we look at the examples, I'll talk about some things you can do. You can change the beginning year. Instead of going back to 2009, change it and go back to 2010 and use 9 years instead of 10. The other thing you can do is just not use the number at all. Don't use a CAGR at all and just look at the numbers. Just say, instead of saying the growth rate's 8%, you just say, hey, this firm, the number was negative 50 million. Now it's $500 million, and you just look at the trend and over time. So there's ways to get around it. Some students somewhat kind of panic because they see an NFMF and say, oh, I've got to change companies. This isn't working. But a lot of companies will have a few of these. It's not a big problem. It's not a serious issue. Now, if everything you have is an NMF, then yeah, you don't want to use that company. But I'm not going to give you a company that has a lot of data issues. All right, so here's the template again. So the way we're going to work with this template is I'm going to walk through each one of these, and then I'm not real sure yet. I'm always, it's a toss-up how do I handle this, but I'm going to go through the template, and then I'm going to walk through the example I have, which is Walmart. None of you are allowed to do Walmart because Walmart is the example company. I'm going to walk through Walmart and go in detail on each one of these. And it's a very specific template. I actually want to show you the template now so you can just see how it works. But I want you to follow the template precisely. All right, this is not a creative writing. In fact, I'm going to walk you through the Excel chart I built, or Excel file I built for Walmart, but also the Word document I built for Walmart. And you can actually, on this first big project that you're doing, this first individual project that you're doing, you are allowed to take the Walmart Word document and edit it for your company. So plagiarism is not an issue as far as using my Walmart. You can't use other students as your own independent work, but you can use the Walmart and use that template. So that's the process we're going to go through. Let me show you the actual template Not that you're going to know it yet, because we're going to walk through it in detail, and you're going to learn it as we go step by step, but more so you can see where we're going. All right, so here's the template we are going to use. Here's liquidity, it's 15%, solvency is 15%, asset turnover is 15%, margin is 15%, your summary of the short term is 5%, your summary of the long term is 5%, return on equity is 7%, relative value analysis is 7%, the Excel table, which I've already built for you, all you have to do is clean it up and put it into your paper, that's 6%, and the graphs, cleaning them up, putting a good title of them, that's 10%. So this is where we're going. You can see how specifically detailed I want you to be on each one of these. Now, I like this template. I've had several students in their first job, and they've been told to do a financial analysis of a company, and they just did what they did in this class, and their employer was impressed. It's a very good tool, very good model. The other thing that's nice about this, even though you're using my paper and editing it, when you finish it, it will be your paper, it will be your words. That gives you a really impressive looking financial analysis that you can put on LinkedIn and use an example of your work of a financial analysis. So it's a high quality product that you can use to demonstrate that you can do financial analysis. So I really want to, put a strong effort in this so that you really understand what we're looking for here and how to assess a company. So that's where we're headed. All right, so let's look at again at this template. I'm using some redundancy, you can see, between class 3 and 4 because I want this. I don't want you to learn this for your project. I want you to learn this for the rest of your life and actually know this forever. So especially if you're a finance or accounting major, you need to know this. But even cybersecurity, marketing, management, you need to know this stuff. It's extremely important. If you're a marketing major, you need to understand how your marketing project is impacting the activity ratios and margin ratios of your firm. If you're cybersecurity, you need to understand how the investments you're making in information technology is impacting the return on equity of your firm. How is it impacting all these kind of things? So these are important things to know. Management, if you're a management major, you've got to know all of this because you are the front line managing all of this. Your employees are going to inspect the activity and margin ratios for all of this. So it's important to know for everybody, but especially accounting and finance majors. So we're going to start off looking at short-term viability. Will this firm survive for the next 5 years? Or are they about to go insolvent? Now, the firms I'm giving you will score very well on liquidity and solvency, but I still want you to go through the analysis. All right? So liquidity is, do you have the cash to pay your bills? Solvency is, do you have too much debt? All right, so we'll get into those two. Once you figure out, hey, this firm is going to survive, then you start looking to the long term and start looking at growth. Is this firm going to grow? And your growth analysis is really focused on two things. Top line growth, which is your revenue. Is the business itself growing? And then the second one is the bottom line growth, which is margin. So top line, while the business growing, margins is, well, is the business profitable? So activity ratios, you could be growing your business fast, so you have really great top line growth, but you're unprofitable. So Amazon was like that for many years. Their revenues are growing really fast, but they just weren't very profitable. They're actually losing money for the longest time. Now they're finally profitable and they're making money, but for the longest time they were focused entirely on top line growth. We also call it turnover, an important term here. Now they're finally starting to get the margins, and you're seeing their stock price. They're really doing well. We can bring all this together and look at return on equity. I have return on equity under growth, but return on equity actually covers solvency, activity, and margins all in one ratio. And then activity ratios, I talked last class about them being closely tied to liquidity. So activity and liquidity are closely tied. So when we bring it all together with return on equity, we're going to do what's called return on equity decomposition. We have a good sense of how this firm is doing. We have the details on each one as we built it up, and then we have a great summary of the entire thing. So that gives us a good sense of long term. And then we step back and say, okay, how is this firm doing? short-term and long-term. Is this firm doing better than the typical firm or doing worse than the typical firm? And that's going to give us a sense of, should this firm's stock be expensive or be cheap? Expensive means it's a much more valuable firm. It's trading high. We'll talk about in specifically what a price to earnings ratio is. But say, wow, my company looks great. It should be expensive. Then you look at the relative value and say, wow, it is expensive, just like I expected. Or this firm's really struggling. I think this firm should be trading cheap to other companies. You look at the relative value and say, you know what, my firm's actually trading expensive. What's going on? Maybe this company's overvalued. Maybe this is a dangerous time to buy this stock. But we'll get into that in detail. What do you need to know? You're going to notice in this analysis that I'm not making you memorize a lot of ratios. You as a finance major, you should know these ratios. However, what you're going to find really quickly, once you graduate and you get into whatever field you're going to cover, is that these ratios are very, very industry specific. And so me having you memorize a lot of ratios is not really going to benefit you because you don't know what industry you're walking into. My first job was in the life insurance industry. None of the ratios we're covering here, the detail ratios, work in that industry. It's a very, very different industry. In fact, the companies I will not give you for this first project, are insurance companies and banks. They just don't fit. They have liquidity, solvency, activity, and margins, but their ratios are radically different than what we're using in this project. So what you need to know is a higher level. What do we mean by liquidity? What do we mean by solvency? What is a turnover ratio? What is a margin? You don't need the specific detailed calculation. So you need to know what the key ratios are, but you don't have to necessarily memorize the formulas. Now, there are some places I'm going to talk about the formulas. You need to know that an activity ratio is some measure of revenue divided by some measure of assets. But beyond that, we don't have to get all that overly specific with memorizing a lot of formulas. So you need to know what ratios. So what ratios do we look at under liquidity? What ratios do we look under solvency? You need to know whether higher is better or lower is better. So margins, we prefer to have high margins versus low margins. For activity ratios, we prefer to have high turnover rather than low turnover. You need to be able to look at trends and look at them versus peers. Make sure you comment on shocking numbers. Don't have a number in your chart, just zoom up or zoom down. You don't say something about it. So that's extremely important. You know, that's one thing I tell students is don't go in to talk to your boss and you forget the most obvious thing on the chart. And the first thing your boss is going to look, she's going to see a number shooting off the chart and say, so what happened there? You go, oh, I don't know. I didn't look into that. That's just going to make you look like you didn't do your homework. You didn't do your analysis. So make sure you comment on those shocking things on the chart. So rules of thumb are helpful, but we just don't have them because they're so industry specific. But again, we're going to be looking at these versus industry, and that will give you some sense if your firm's way out of line or not. So you will have a little bit of rules of thumb. All right, so how important is this? Well, let me just tell you my history. When I was at UTSA, we hired a new CEO, a man named Bob Davis, very much a finance kind of person. He came into UTSA. I was in a job where I got to work with him very closely. He kind of picked me as his investment person. And so I was in his office constantly. It was really just, I was in the right place at the right time. And so he comes into UTSA, and he's coming in to fix it. He's the guy who restructured UTSA. We had a huge 20-25% layoff, kind of the first time in UTSA's history. He came in, guess what he did? The first thing he did is I came to him with some charts, and I said, UTSA is becoming extremely illiquid. At that time, we were buying theme parks. We were building these high-rise buildings for retirement centers. We had this real estate subsidiary, and it was just doing all kinds of ridiculous things. It was really just draining the cash off the UTSA, and yet UTSA's liabilities were growing dramatically. So our need for liquidity was increasing, but we were actually becoming less liquid. He immediately fixed that. And very quickly, within a couple of years, UTSA's liquidity improved dramatically. The next thing he looked at was UTSA's solvency. And he said, UTSA does not have enough net worth relative to its risk And he immediately addressed that, and within a few years, USAA was extremely well capitalized. We had tremendous net worth relative to our risk. Then he started looking at growth. Now, he went out of order. The first thing he looked at was margins, profitability. We showed him a chart which showed that revenue growth was slower than expense growth. And he says, hey, you're running this company into the ground. You can't have any company whose revenues are growing at 5%, but their expenses are growing at 10%. So he restructured the entire firm, greatly reduced USA's expenses, and USA's margins shot up. And then he started talking activity ratios, revenue growth. And he said something, a term that USAA had not used prior to that. And he said, we will sell our products. Prior to that, USAA said, we don't sell. What we do is provide service to our customers. And Bob Davis said, no, you are going to start selling product. And that's when he started this whole new thing of cross-selling. So if a bank representative is selling an auto loan to someone, as soon as he finishes that call, he's going to say, hey, do you have auto insurance? And he's going to try to transfer that person over to the property and casualty side to sell auto insurance. So they were looking for these opportunities to cross-sell products from different places. And USA's revenue shot up. USA expanded into the enlisted market. So you can see Bob Davis came into USAA and really radically changed the firm. Some people loved what he did, some people hated what he did, but it was probably tough medicine that USAA needed at the time. But he did exactly what we're talking about. He looked at slightly different ratios, but they were similar. They weren't radically different than what we're looking at. And he told the company, we will get this ratio to where it needs to be over the next few years. And he was adamant about it. If it wasn't happening, he would replace people and bring in new people and say, you've got to get this done. You have a limited period of time to do it. So pretty intense. So I'm not showing you stuff that's not used in practice. This is real life stuff. All right, so let's look at this process. I think what I'm going to do, I'm thinking about this night, I might change my mind, is I think I want to cover liquidity and solvency and then go back and show you Walmart. So we'll do all the short-term viability assessment first. So I'll show you the class notes, then show you Walmart. Then you can be working on the short-term assessment of your firm. And then the next few classes, I'll start on the long-term growth side. So you have enough so you can work on your firm, and then we'll go to the next thing. That way we don't cover it all and you can't start working on your firm. So we'll try that. I might change my mind and show you Walmart for liquidity before getting into solvency, but we'll see. I never can decide how I want to do this. So let's start with liquidity. So liquidity has two components. First is how much cash is this firm producing? What is its operating cycle? So we're trying to figure out, is this a cash deficit operating cycle or is this a cash rich operating cycle? Does the operating cycle create cash or does it eat up cash? So that's the first thing we're going to look at. The second thing is, if the firm needs cash, can they get their hands on it? Do they have liquid resources? We're not going to spend very much money on that second one. That's really where the solvency analysis comes in. You know, do they have the ability to borrow money, issue stock? So we're not going to cover that. So we're really going to focus on this first one, the operating cycle, also known as the cash conversion cycle. Now let's say you're a management major. If you're a management major, one of the most important functions in your job is managing this cash conversion cycle. So let's talk about it. Why is it so important? The firms that do this well tend to do it extremely well. They have it down to a science. So what is the operating cycle? The operating cycle is from the very first thing they do in their operations, which is they purchase materials. Maybe they purchase raw materials and they make something. Now, Walmart might not do that. Walmart may actually purchase the final inventory that they're going to sell. But they either buy the raw materials to make what they're going to sell, or they buy the product that they're going to sell. They take that inventory and they put it in the inventory. They now have stuff to sell. They then sell it, but maybe they sell it on credit. So they don't have any cash yet. And then finally they collect on their accounts receivable. So if you think about it, they buy raw materials. Well, that's cash going out the doors. They take that raw materials and they produce inventory. That's cash going out the door. They then store that inventory in a big warehouse somewhere. Well, that's cash going out the door. They then sell it. They gotta hire salespeople. That's cash going out the door. Finally, they collect on the receivables. They have cash coming in the door. So for a normal company, the cash operating cycle is a cash outflow. It's a use of cash. They spend money to get set up, and then finally at the very end, they receive cash from their customers. Usually suppliers are paid early. Now, some firms, they buy materials from their suppliers, but they don't pay their suppliers. They have immediately. They have an accounts payable. So they may not pay their suppliers for 30 or 45 days, so you don't always have to have cash go out the door at day 0. But suppliers for most firms are paid before the firm gets cash from their customers. Not always, but usually. So for most firms, the operating cycle is a negative cash flow, especially for growing companies. So here we're getting into the tough things. Put your seatbelt on, get ready. This is, for most students, the hardest part of this entire paper 1. So don't get frustrated. It's like, wow, this is really hard to understand, because the nice thing is it gets a lot easier after this. All right, so just buckle down, really put your thinking cap on, make sure you're fully engaged. Don't be checking Facebook or social media. Fully engaged, listen to everything I'm saying here, and then be ready for questions when we do our class sessions. So we're going to use the term net working capital requirement. What we mean by this is all those assets that are directly tied to the operating cycle. We want to look at them and see if that is a cash user or a cash source. So what are the working capital assets? Accounts receivable. We just saw that's directly related to the operating cycle. Inventory. That's directly related to the operating cycle. Prepaid expenses. So maybe you're a retail company and you have to pay rent on the place where you're selling your stuff. Well, that's part of your operating cycle. You have to have that place to be able to sell. So that's a prepaid expense. All right. Then you have accounts payable. That's how you pay your vendors. All right. So you buy materials. You might see accounts payable or trade payable. Either one is fine. Accountants are not real precise in these terms. And then you have accrued expenses. Your accrued expenses are like your salaries payable. Remember, we had your salespeople. You got to pay them. So you pay them salaries, but you don't pay them all at once. You don't pay them every hour that they work. You might pay them every 2 weeks or every week. And so until you pay them, you owe them money. Now, another one I don't have in here, but I think is important, is unearned revenue. So this is one you might put on the side. I really should add this to the for some firms this is huge. So there are firms who actually don't have their collections at the end. They actually collect their money at the beginning. I just talked about, if you're in real estate, you get your rents before the month starts, not at the end. So you actually get you get paid your revenue before you've earned it. Another good example is airlines. If you've ever bought airline tickets, you pay for your airline tickets way before, way before, sometimes for me 9 months before you actually take the flight. That's unearned revenue. You get your cash today, but you don't have to give the product to the customer for months. So that can be a huge for some of your industries. I don't know if I'm going to give you an airline for your paper 1 because airlines have really struggled, but it can be really, really critical for certain industries. Now, here's where I'm going to blow your mind, mainly because this so contradicts what you learned in your accounting class. So you're going to have to throw out some of this in your accounting class. Now, I'm hoping you accounting majors, if you see the accounting side of this, that you'll challenge your professor. I also hope some of you will challenge me. All of you will challenge me and say, okay, I'm not buying this. I've had students in this class in the past say, I'm just not buying it. I don't see it. So we had a debate. I was able to convert most of them. But this number, we take accounts receivable plus inventory plus prepaids minus the payables minus the accrued expenses minus unearned revenue. And if this is a positive number, then their operating cycle is a use of cash. And that is negative for liquidity. A positive number is negative for liquidity. If it's a negative number, if these three are greater than these three, then your operating cycle is actually a source of cash. A high number is bad, a low number is good. Positive numbers are normal, but they're not as good as negative numbers. I'll show you why the accounting side looks at this the exact opposite. So we're definitely not going to finish liquidity today, so I had my hopes too high, but that's fine. We need to take our time with this. This is a tough issue. All right. So we're not going to talk. I'm going to let me real quickly throw this out. We'll just get this out of the way. This has to do with the second one of your liquidity needs. Meeting that liquidity is tied to networking, but what we tend to say with finance is short-term seasonal needs for cash. That can be backed with short-term financing. Long-term needs for cash, fixed assets, other things. That should be backed with long-term financing resources like long-term debt and issuing stock. And the key here is finance does not like short-term debt. We prefer firms not use short-term debt. And the reason for that is it exposes you to interest rates going up and down, and also exposes you to capital markets freezing. If you're using a lot of short-term debt, you're constantly going back to the capital markets and asking for cash. And if you have a year like 2008 or June of 2020 where capital markets just freeze up, it's really dangerous. But we won't get much more into this. We're not going to talk much about this, but do make sure you know finance gets really worried when they see short-term debt suddenly jump up a bunch. Okay, but what that means is the net working capital requirement can be supported with short-term debt if it's a temporary thing. Like at year end, if you're a retail company and you have really large increases in receivables and inventory because it's during the holiday shopping season, using short-term debt for that is fine. But if this number is a positive number all year long, you should use long-term financing to manage your working capital requirement. All right. You notice in my short-term, my current assets, I don't have cash. In my current liabilities, I don't have debt. Cash and short-term debt are not considered part of the operating cycle. They're considered outside of the operating cycle, and they're either the product of the operating cycle, which is cash, or they're needed in order to fill the gaps, those uses of cash for the operating cycle. All right. I know it's tough. It's a little bit, we'll see it when we get into Walmart example too, you'll see it in a little more detail. For older companies, later in their life cycle, their working capital tends to be a source of cash. It might be because they're declining growth, and what that means is they're collecting a lot of receivables. They're not having to buy a lot of new inventory because they're just not growing that fast. So they tend to be more liquid. Unfortunately, not growing really fast. For management majors, this is why I say this is so important, because you're managing the inventory. Think about just-in-time inventory. You want that inventory showing up right in time, right when you need it. Why? Because you don't want to spend all that cash and get all that inventory and have it just sit in your store. That's going to kill your liquidity. You don't want to spend all that money, inventory, and it sits there for 3 or 4 months, and you just wasted all that cash. You'd rather buy the inventory, have it show up right when you need it. So some firms have really short collection cycles, like a grocery store. You probably don't owe H-E-B or Walmart money. You probably did it in your credit card, and the credit card banks will reimburse Walmart and H-E-B really rapidly, maybe the same day. Who knows? I don't know how quickly those things happen. And so those type of stores, their inventory shows up right on time because you don't want heads of lettuce or apples or tomatoes sitting there in the store for months and months and months. You want them showing up right on time. And then you collect money from your customers really, really quickly. So firms that have working capital as a use of cash, what do they need to do? Well, if it's a seasonal use of cash, they can use short-term debt to handle that. If it's a permanent use of cash, you can use long-term financing. If it's mixed, they can use short-term for the short-term seasonal needs and long-term for the permanent working capital needs. So that's fine. Debt is okay for managing your working capital requirement as long as you line it up for whether it's temporary or permanent. And long-term financing, like I said, that's long-term debt, stock, issuing stock, retaining your earnings. All right, so here's what I was talking about before. I've already covered this. So why is short-term debt so bad? You have the funding risk. Capital markets may be frozen. You have interest rate risks. Interest rates are shooting up and down. But we're not going to spend much time on this in our class. This is more of a corporate finance cost of capital kind of discussion, and you'll get more of that in your next finance class for those that are finance majors. So what are we trying to do with this working capital requirement? And our goal, whether we're finance or accounting or management, our goal is to try to reduce those working capital requirements by managing the operating cycle. What does that mean? We want to reduce accounts receivable. We want to reduce inventories. We want to reduce prepaid expenses. We want to increase payables. We want to increase accrued expenses if we can, if it's reasonable. So what do we mean by reduce accounts receivable? Well, we'd rather have people pay us today than pay us 30 days from now. So what can we do to try to get our customers to pay us faster? So I mentioned HEB. HEB used to take checks. Some of y'all have maybe never written a check in your entire life. But HEB used to accept checks. So HEB would get a check at the grocery store, and then they would take all those checks at the end of the day, bundle them up, take them to their bank. So they still don't have any cash yet. All they have is a bunch of pieces of paper. Their bank then takes all those checks, and they fly them around the country to get them cleared. Maybe most of them are in the same city the check was given, but some of them may be out of town. Then those banks have to receive those checks, have to clear them, and send money back through the system to HEB's banks. So it could take 2 or 3 days for HEB to get the money. Well, today what HEB does is what's called truncation. They take the check, to the extent they get checks anymore, they take the check and they actually read the micro line on the check, and they probably are going to get their money for that check same day, today. So they've cut 3 days off of their receivables. Instead of having to process checks and having them fly all over the country, expensive and time consuming, they get all their money today. On inventories, you as a management major, if you are a management major, you want to figure out how to do inventory. Some of y'all will be doing quantity management types of programs. So you want to make sure your inventory shows up right when you need it, but you also want to avoid stockouts. What happens, like we saw in 2020, people start buying a bunch of toilet paper just overnight. How do you get that inventory? So those shocks to the systems, that's a downside to just-in-time inventory. A shock to the system, and suddenly you have stock out. But the reasons we want to have just-in-time inventory is to reduce that operating cycle as much as possible. Accounts and trade payables. Hey, if you can figure out a way to pay your vendors later, so you keep the cash longer without harming those relationships, and they don't complain, they don't get mad. If you can do that, that's fine. I doubt you're going to try to find ways to pay your employees later, but that's certainly possible. Unearned revenue, if you can get your customers to pay you early, that's a wonderful thing. I've noticed with hotels, when I order a hotel online, they'll offer me a discount if I will do it as non-cancelable. And if I do it as non-cancelable, they'll actually take the cash out of my credit card today, and that means the hotel will get their cash today, or whoever, maybe it's the travel agent. They'll get their cash today. If I don't take the discount, they won't charge my credit card until I stay at the hotel. So you can see they have a discount, so they're inducing me to take the hotel today and get the guarantee. So maybe I save $10 a night. I say, well, I'm absolutely sure I'm taking this trip. I'm not going to get sick, whatever. I mean, there's a chance I get the discount, but they get their cash up front. So you see there's firms that are willing to offer big discounts just so they can get rid of that, increase that under revenue. They want their cash today. All right, so we'll start here. Boy, I should have known liquidity is going to take more time. I'm surprised I didn't know that, but we'll start here. What we're going to do next is, at the beginning of the next class, I'm going to tell you why this is so different than what the accountants tell you, the accounting classes say. I'm also going to give you a really powerful way to ask your accounting professors to prove that their approach is better than the approach of finance, all right? Now, and I want you to do it in your accounting classes. Don't use my name. I know Dr. Sanders, he's a wonderful professor. I don't want you, well, you can, I guess that's okay. Maybe we could set up a debate between me and Dr. Sanders on how accounting looks at this versus finance, because I think it'd be a wonderful debate. But I want you to understand why we do not use the current ratio in finance, but they use it all the time in accounting. All right, so you're looking for that. That'd be exciting to get into this next class. A good debate.